So now that you have your color wheel complete, this color wheel represents that first characteristic of color. It represents hue, or you can also call it local color. So the name of each one of these, you should be able to recognize each of the 12 hues on the color wheel and be able to mix them. However, color is much more complex than just naming the hue, because you can also have the second characteristic of color, which is value. Value is really important because every color can range from light to dark, and you have all of those different steps of value in between. Now, a classic painting exercise would be to paint a traditional value scale like you see here. However, we're going to change this up a little bit and try something a little bit different that should be a little bit more exciting. So today you are going to need a couple of supplies. First, you'll need a ruler, pencil, and a pair of scissors. And then in your art supply kit that I provided to you, you should have 2 half sheets that are 6 by 9 inches of watercolor paper from your supply kit. So you should be able to measure it across. It's 9 inches by 6 inches. Now, one of those pieces of paper, you're going to very carefully set it off to the side because we're not going to use it yet. We're going to save that for a different painting. But then with the other piece of paper, what I want you to do is take it and we're going to divide it in half. So along the 9-inch side, I want you to find at the top a 4.5 inch measurement across, and then slide down to the bottom edge of the ruler and measure 4.5 inches across again. This should give you 2 tick marks at the top and bottom where you can lightly divide your paper in half. Next, very carefully cut right along that line to cut this into 2 pieces of paper. Now you should be able to measure them. It should be 6 inches by 4.5 inches. Now we're only going to be using one of these today, but we're going to go ahead and prep both of them by taping them down to our table surface. So grab your masking tape, and you can either tape it directly to your table surface, or if you think you might need to move your paintings, you can tape them to a clipboard like I'm doing here, or even the front of a notebook would work great for this. So the first thing I want you to do is tear a piece of masking tape to the length of one side of your piece of paper. And so what you're going to do with this is tape it along the edge of your paper, maybe about 1/8 of an inch, as close to the edge of your paper as you can, where you are just barely holding it onto the paper, but it should be mostly on your board or your table. And very carefully make sure you press it into place. And you're going to go all the way around all 4 sides. Now, a good trick that I want to tell you about, sometimes masking tape can actually tear your paper when you go to peel it off later, and that can be really, really sad. So a great trick that you can do is for each piece of masking tape, instead of sticking it directly to your paper, first stick it onto your jeans or whatever pair of pants you're wearing, and then immediately peel it back off, and then you're ready to put it on your paper. That little trick lets your jeans take away just a little bit of the super sticky tackiness of the tape, and then it ends up actually making it less likely to tear your paper later. So that is a great trick to use. Now, for the rest of the assignment today, you're going to need, of course, your watercolors, a water cup, paper towel, all that sort of good stuff. If your paint palette is dirty from where you painted your color wheel, just rinse that off in the sink, and then you are going to be ready to go. So the kind of painting that we're going to be doing today is a little bit more exciting than just a standard value scale. We're going to be creating an abstract little painting that I'm going to call a veil painting, where we create lots of very light transparent layers of color that builds one on top of the other and creates this really cool abstract little miniature painting. So these are some different examples that I've experimented with using 2 or 3 colors. This one I experimented adding in some metallic gold to my layers along some of the edges, and you can kind of see how these are going to build up to create these really organic, abstract, beautiful little miniature paintings. Now, the whole point of this assignment today is it's going to teach you a very important skill in working with watercolors called glazing. Glazing is where you paint one layer of color and then let it completely dry and then paint another layer over top of it. And that's going to glaze color to build darker and darker values. Because proper technique with watercolor is traditionally where you start with light values and then you gradually build to darker and darker values. So to begin our painting today, I've got all of my supplies and I'm ready to go. And what you want to do is choose two of your primary colors. Now, yellow I think is the hardest one to use just because yellow doesn't go very dark on its own. So I'm going to pick the blue, and then I really also love the magenta, the cool red color. So I think those are the two that I'm going to work with today. So you can pick one of the colors that you want to start with, and you're going to mix up a super light color where it is mostly water and then just a tiny bit of paint. We want this to be a very fluid, very thin wash that we're going to create for this first layer. So for this first wash, I can choose anywhere on my paper that I want this to go, and I'm going to start with a nice edge. Now I can use straight lines or curvy lines, whatever you want to do, but I'm going to paint along that edge and then paint everything back behind it that same value. So this is going to create my lightest wash of color, and you have to work fairly quickly to make sure that the paint all blends and becomes one smooth area of color, and this part should take up about half of your piece of paper. And as soon as this is complete, the most important step of this painting to make it work is to make sure that this layer dries completely before I move on to the next step. So to speed this process along, you can use a hairdryer and dry this a little bit faster, or you can take a break for about 15 minutes and maybe work on another class assignment and then come back to it, and it should be ready to move on to the next step. Now, you'll know that it's ready and completely dry when you touch the paper and nothing smears and the paper feels completely dry and not cool. If it feels cool to the touch, that means it still has some moisture left in it. So really make sure it's completely dry before you move on to the next step. Our next step is going to be to pick up our second color that you're going to use and rinse your brush, and make sure you start with a nice fresh clean brush. And we're going to mix an equally light version of this second color. So make sure you add lots and lots of water. This should be a very light color, tons of water and just a tiny bit of paint. And so now we're going to create another edge on the opposite side with this color. It can overlap your first color some, but you do want to make sure that you have some white left on your piece of paper. So you can see that mine overlap a little bit, and then I have my small white section left. And then let that completely dry before you move on to this second layer. So now you're going to go back to your very first color and mix another really light version of that color. So lots of water and just a tiny bit of paint. And you're going to create a second edge that's just a little bit stepped back, a little bit further over than the first edge, and then fill in all of the space back behind it. This is going to create a very gradual step in value where you can see the first layer and then that step up where it's one layer that's slightly darker. Now let that completely dry and you'll mix up your second layer of your second color and repeat that process. So step it back just a little bit where it's a little bit behind that first layer and fill in all of the space behind it going off the edge of the page. So once you let that step completely dry, that finishes two values in each one of your colors. Now you're going to progressively continue and add a third layer and a fourth layer all the way through, gradually getting darker as you go. So on this third layer, you can see I've mixed up my color just a tiny bit darker with just a smidge more paint pigment into it, to let it be slightly darker than the step before it. And ever so slightly, this is just going to be a practice of mixing those colors and building more and more pigment with less water to gradually, very slowly over time, build up those layers. And each time, notice I'm rinsing my brush and as I switch between the colors. And I'm also using a hairdryer in between each layer to make sure that it's completely dry before I move on to the next step. If I add a layer on top of a layer that's still wet, my colors are going to bleed and sort of run together, and then I won't have those nice, distinct little layers of my colors the way that you see here. So letting it dry completely is very important in order for all of these little stair steps of veils or glazes of color, in order for those to work. Now, as you step back, notice my lines start to vary and change. Sometimes they have some different types of curves in them. Sometimes they're further or closer to the previous line. Some of that organic variation is what makes this painting so beautiful as you build and continue adding in each one of those layers. So this is really fun. There's no exact right way to add in the next layer as long as it's a little bit darker and a little bit further stepped back from the previous one. This painting is going to turn out great. Now your goal for this assignment is to create at least 8 distinct layers for each of your 2 colors. You should be able to go through and count the little layers as you go and kind of keep track of them. And as you get to the darker and darker layers, notice you're going to be mixing your paints with more pigment, more of the paint mixed in, and less water each time. That way you can have those nice distinct values, and that's what's going to give this painting the richness of it. Now once you get to the end of your painting, go back and count to make sure that you have at least 8 steps for each side of your colors. And then once it's completely dry, very, very carefully peel that tape away. And so be very careful to not tear your paper as you do this. This is going to give you a really nice clean white border and reveal your finished painting.